When most people think about Dracula, they think about vampires, coffins and fangs and bats and castles and all these horror tropes that are so common that it's easy to forget where they started. But after reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, I came away convinced that we don't have to read this book as if it's primarily about vampires. I think this book is about evil. More specifically, it's about the nature of evil, the seductive power of evil, and what we have to do to be able to overcome it. And while I would not call Dracula a Christian novel in the same way that I would call Pilgrim's Progress a Christian novel, I was actually surprised with how many themes are in this book that resonate with a biblical worldview. And it's not because it gets every theological detail right. It doesn't. And as a Protestant, there are times where I would understand things differently than Stoker did. But when you zoom out, this book understands several truths that Christians should immediately recognize. So hit like and let's look at the first one. Evil is real. That may sound obvious in a book that's about vampires, but I don't think that it is. It's mind-boggling to think that the statement evil is real can be controversial, but it is, because modern day people tend to explain evil away. We reduce it to ignorance, to bad choices, bad circumstances, even psychological problems, and just find ways to explain evil away as something other than evil. And while those things could definitely contribute to corrupt human behavior, I think this book is saying that evil is something deeper, something that's part of a nature that can corrupt. It's a force that's able to take things that are good and twist it and pervert them and change them into something that is bad. We see that in this book often, and it's actually quite striking that Dracula in this book rarely ever gets what he wants through the use of force. Instead, he seduces people, he tempts people into his service. Dracula is a deceiver. And isn't that exactly the way that scripture describes sin? In Proverbs chapter 9, we see this personified figure of folly calling out in the streets. And it says, "Stolen water is sweet and bread eaten in secret is pleasant, but he does not know that the dead are there and that her guests are in the depths of Sheol." See, sin always presents itself as sweet before you get the taste of bitterness. And that's exactly what Jonathan Harker experiences when he's in Dracula's castle. One night as he lays in bed, these vampire women enter his room and he describes them this way. Sweet it was in one sense, but with a bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness as one smells in blood. You see, the temptation is real, the attraction is real, the invitation to pleasure is real, but underneath all of it, there is this sense of corruption. Jonathan even admits it when he says, "I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited." And to me, that's one of my most important observations in this novel, because we see evil that has power, but it is not merely attacking. Like I said, it's seducing, it's deceiving. Because when the forces of evil show up to use temptation in your life, they don't show up with a pitchfork and a tail. They show up as angels of light. Sin never announces itself as destructive. It always comes as something that offers pleasure. And Dracula understands that. And that's one of the reasons why this novel feels so relevant today. But the second theme that surprised me the most in this reading was the role that Christianity played inside of the story. Because in this book, Christianity is not merely decorative. I've read many stories that frame themselves as Christian novels, and essentially they are characters doing things out in the world that have kind of like this underpinning of Christian faith, but it's never really a force that a lot of characters rely upon. It's more like a comforting presence, but never the driving force of action. But in this book, this spiritual evil demands a spiritual response, and we see that in the characters. Now, I want to say this with as much love as I can and respect, but as a Protestant, I don't believe that spiritual power resides in physical objects like a crucifix or a relic. That power belongs to God alone. But looking at the big picture, what fascinated me the most about this book is that Stoker is presenting evil as something that is unable to stand against divine authority. Early in the novel, Jonathan receives a crucifix from an old woman in a village as he's on his way to Castle Dracula. At first, he's uncomfortable with it. He admits that he's been taught to think of these things with suspicion and as merely superstitious objects. Yet later, when he is trapped and terrified in the castle, he says this: "Bless that good woman who hung the crucifix around my neck, for it is a comfort and a strength to me whenever I touch it." So how do I read this? Because I'm not looking at that scene and saying, okay, that crucifix has some type of religious power that's going to protect them. I think that Jonathan is seeing this moment and realizing that there is a bigger spiritual reality that he wasn't really aware of. He is realizing that evil is real, and if evil is real, then God must be real as well. And that theme becomes really evident in the character of Van Helsing, one of the favorite characters in the book. And one thing that I love about him the most is that he's not anti-science. In fact, he's one of the most accomplished scientists in the entire book. But unlike some of the other characters, Van Helsing realizes that there is this bigger reality than what can be measured and contained and examined. At one point, he says this: "It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all. And if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain." And for a novel that was published in 1897, that feels really relevant to today. Because people tend to think that science somehow is competing with faith. And I don't think Christians should be afraid of science. Science is not the issue. Of course, there is the type of science that comes with its materialistic presuppositions and says that the only things that are real are things that are measurable by empirical evidence. That's already putting a limit on any conclusion that you can draw. And there is a problem with thinking that science can explain everything. But the scriptures teach us that there are things that science cannot explain. And one of those things that we see in this book is that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and authorities and principalities. And Dracula is one of those stories where these characters have to learn that lesson, that they are going to come face to face with things that go beyond their neat little boxes and categories, and will have to decide whether they acknowledge those things or reject them. But of all the Christian themes that this novel has, the one I find most resonating is that of sacrificial love. The more I read this book, the more I realized that Dracula and the heroes were moving in completely opposite directions. Yes, at the end of the novel, they all converge in the same place, but the way that they get there is so starkly different. Dracula takes, the heroes give. Dracula consumes, the heroes sacrifice. Dracula feeds on others, and the heroes literally pour themselves out for each other. Again and again, these characters put themselves in position, in harm's way, willing to suffer for the sake of another. They give their literal blood, they risk their lives, they sacrifice their comfort and their peace and their safety, all for another person. This immediately reminds me of the words of Jesus in John 15:13 that say, "Greater love has no one than this, than someone lay down his life for his friends." And in this book, the heroes don't defeat Dracula because they're stronger than he is. They defeat him because they refuse to stop loving each other. And nowhere is that more evident than what is, in my opinion, the most powerful scene in the entire novel: the death of Lucy. Or perhaps more accurately, what could be interpreted as her redemption. By that point in the story, Lucy has become one of the undead. But what's interesting is that evil hasn't made her ugly. It actually makes her more beautiful, more seductive, more desirable. And Arthur, the man who is in love with her, is forced to make a choice. He's forced to confront evil wearing the face of the woman he loves. And then we come to one of the most incredible passages in the entire book. Stoker writes this: "Arthur took the stake and the hammer, and when once his mind was set on action, his hands never trembled nor even quivered. Arthur placed the point over the heart, and as I looked, I could see its dint in the white flesh. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the open red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and high duty seemed to shine through it. The sight of it gave us courage so that our voices seemed to ring through the little vault. And then the writhing and quivering of the body became less, and the teeth seemed to champ and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still. The terrible task was over. Man, that was powerful. But the one phrase that stuck with me about that whole thing is that Stoker calls it the mercy-bearing stake. Mercy-bearing. Think about that. Some people could say that Arthur's actions could be seen as cruel. He's driving a stake through the heart of the woman he once loved. But he understands something that some people may not. What is before him is not Lucy as she was truly meant to be. The thing that he loved has been corrupted, and if he truly loves her, then he would do anything possible to end the corruption, even when doing so breaks his heart. And to me, I find that scene so biblical. It's not because Christians are called out to hunt vampires, but because we're called to wage war against sin. Romans 8 says, "If by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live." Notice that language. It's put to death. Not manage, not negotiate, not tolerate. Put to death. And to me, that's where Dracula unexpectedly turns this mirror around on us. Because it's easy to identify the monster in this story. We know where Dracula is. We know that he is evil. The harder question is, do we recognize when that evil tries to find a home within us? Because the truth is that most of us don't struggle to reject the sins that we hate. We struggle to reject the sins that we love. Our pride, our greed, our self-ambition, our bitterness, our lust. Sins that have become familiar and comfortable and even precious to us. See, Arthur's challenge here is not merely killing a monster, it's destroying something that looks like the thing he loves. And that's often our challenge too. Can we drive a spiritual stake through the heart of the sins that we're attached to? Are we willing to mortify the things that are destroying us that we think bring us happiness? Can we hate evil enough to destroy it even when it looks beautiful, even when it's attractive, even when it's familiar? That's the question that I walked away from Dracula thinking about. Not whether vampires existed, but whether I take sin seriously enough. Whether I can recognize how seductive evil can be. Whether I understand that evil is not merely out there, but it also is fighting to find a place in here. And that's why Dracula has endured for more than a century. Because beneath all the Gothic horror and the vampire mythology, there is a story about human struggle. A story about temptation, a story about sacrifice, a story about putting evil to death. And a story that ultimately points to the fact that evil is real, that it is seductive, that it promises life while giving death, but that evil is not invincible. Darkness can be overcome because through faith and courage and sacrificial love and ultimately the power of God, evil can be overcome. Evil will be overcome. Thanks for watching. My name is Eric. This is Blessed and Bookmarked. We love to talk about books here on this channel. So if that's something that interests you, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't lose any future videos that are coming out. If you have a book that you'd be interested in hearing from a Christian perspective, let me know what it is in the comments below. Here at the end, I'll leave a playlist for another series that is not a Christian series, but can be interpreted through a Christian lens, the Red Rising trilogy. I'll also leave another video that YouTube thinks that you would like. Thanks for watching. I'm Eric. Stay blessed, stay bookmarked.